Without us, you could not have done it. We have that wonderful invention, in the American legal system called the contingency fee, where individuals who cannot afford lawyers will hire that lawyer and will go ahead and file these lawsuits. Now, in looking at this, there were survivors who were saying, now we're going to file lawsuits in British courts. It was all noise. Nothing happened. No British lawyer was willing to go ahead and take these cases on, even though there exists the contingency fee cases. No German lawyer, wanted to take on this litigation. Germany doesn't even have a class action, mechanism. Every one of the survivors would have to file a separate lawsuit. Okay? So it was really the certain things about the American legal system and the role, the very aggressive role that American lawyers played in this, I think, is an important element of this. When I speak to law students, I say that, what happened here is kind of a reaction, an antidote to every bad lawyer's joke you've heard. You've heard all these lawyers' jokes, about American lawyers, someone asked me yesterday, an Israeli, well, if you're a lawyer, you have to kind of be crooked, And so that's the bad side of lawyering. This is the good side, that they were able to accomplish this. And I have to tell you, until the lawyers came forward, okay, without that leg, it would have been impossible to do so. And Eisenstadt, who I admit is a lawyer himself, but didn't work as a lawyer, admitted that. He said during the ceremony in Germany, in Berlin, let's be frank, okay, these individuals were responsible. You're part of the necessary story. Now, the last part of it, which has not been discussed at all in this, and I've got a chapter in the book coming out talking about the gray zones. Well, I decided to talk about this, and I want to at least bring this out to this audience, which to me is very problematic. And that is, in many of these cases, actually in most of these cases that were filed against the companies in American courts, they hired major American law firms, and in the major American law firms, Jewish lawyers represented the Swiss banks and the German companies in defending these lawsuits, right? And to me, that presents a moral dilemma. Should they have done that? I have to tell you, I was presented with that dilemma myself, and for me it was easy. When the first lawsuit was filed against Generali, the Italian insurance company, and it was filed in the American court, I got a call from a law firm that was hired to defend that, and they asked me if I want to be part of the defense team. And in fact, the person who called me was a friend of mine, and he said, I want to put you in touch with the partner in the case. And the partner got on the phone and said, Michael, I have to tell you that I'm Jewish also. I didn't know whether I should defend Generali. My father-in-law is a Holocaust survivor. And I talked to my father-in-law, and he gave me his blessing to go ahead and do so. And that was his way of trying to convince me that I should join the team. And I said, let me think about it. I'll call you tomorrow. I knew what the answer was. But there's a postscript to that. This law firm was later fired by Generali, okay, because they had lost the number of motions. Generali then hired another major law firm, where one of the partners in the firm and the person in charge of the defense of Generali is Kenneth Bialkin. Kenneth Bialkin is one of the major mahers in the New York Jewish community, and he was criticized for that. Not just the fact that it's problematic that a Jewish lawyer is defending this, but he's not being hired as a Jewish lawyer. He's being hired also for his Jewish activism. And Bialkin said, well, by being and representing Generali, I can kind of make them see the light of day and can, have them be more generous with this. I have to tell you, from looking at this as a professor in the ivory tower, I have not been involved in any of these lawsuits, and I've tried to stay away from them. I just report on them. I have not seen Generali being any more generous, after Bialkin started being involved in this litigation. And in fact, the latest quote I saw from the head of ICHEC, this international commission, talked about the fact that Generali is a problem, where before they were kind of using them as the poster boy of the insurance companies, how they should behave. So it's kind of it's a problem I'm not sure how to deal with, but I think it's something that I want to bring out. In a discussion I had with Eisenstadt, I asked him that question. I said, if you were in private practice, which he is right now with a major DC law firm, and you were approached by one of these companies, to defend them, would you have defended them? And I have to tell you, he stopped. He said, I've never been asked that question before. And he thought about it for about 10 seconds, and he said, no. And I thought, since this was an on-the-record discussion during a lecture, in that chapter that I've written, I put that in there. Okay? Let me go ahead and stop. I've thrown a lot at you. I can go about this for hours and hours, but at least I want to put the issues out there. Thank you.
Well, we'll take questions as usual. Professor Rafi Israeli, after him Howard Weisbaum. Microphone.
Thank you. I have two points questions. The first one is what I miss in this otherwise very lucid presentation is the real trigger that caused this latest wave of legal cases which ended the way they ended. Because for 50 years, those 3 or 4 legs of the stool existed, they were there. There must have been something that pulled everything together in order to make that possible. The second point is, in the early 50s, there was that agreement between Ben-Gurion and Adenauer about compensation, but in Hebrew, interestingly, it's called shilumim, payments, not damages, not compensation, and it must have...
Payments is not shilumim, it's not...
Well, shilumim, it didn't call it pitzuyim or anything. That's very interesting, but that's a sideline. And my question is, was that a precedent or an impediment to the later agreement that happened 50 years later, and whether Israel was one of the beneficiaries during the distribution process? Thank you.
Sure. That's. Should I just take the questions down?
No, we usually take them one by one.
Yeah, I like to take it one by one. You know, the Germans had a different word for it. You know what the German word was? Right. Okay. And you know, you can't make good.
Making good again.
Yeah, making good again. Yeah. So you know, it's here we're talking about words. Do you see what a role, an important a role that words play? I have to tell you that in this latest Holocaust restitution drama, right? Nobody was paying attention to the 1950s. I think the best discussion of that is in Tom Segut's book, The Seventh Million. He does a really good job of what happened. He discusses that, and there were new personalities involved, and these new personalities never saw that issue. What I saw, and I actually have a discussion in my book about it, is that some of the same fights, the claim that Foxman made, about the last soundbite of the Holocaust, and other people who wrote other editorials saying you shouldn't do this, were making the same arguments, that Begin was making, in the 1950s, and the various individuals. But the people themselves were not seeing that connection. They were refighting, the same fight again, and they came to the same result. Israel, interestingly enough, was not interested in being involved in this, and it was not a major player. All right. At some point, it became involved. It became involved in the German settlement because they were one of the parties invited by Eisenstadt and his German counterpart, Count Lambsdorff, to sit in this big tent to make a settlement. And they also became major players in the insurance litigation. And I have to tell you that I don't think that the representatives from Israel did such a good job in terms of insurance. I don't think anybody did a very good job with it. But now, you might have seen the latest articles, Netanyahu wrote a letter a couple of weeks ago saying, no, we really want to be a major player in the distribution. And so Israel may start playing a bigger role. And now there's that whole fight about, how do you distribute the money? And Israel saying, we have the largest proportion of survivors here, so we should get the largest portion of the funds. Other people are making different arguments. I talk to American survivors, they have their own argument. I talk to people, making the arguments for the so-called double victims in the former Soviet Union, and they make their own arguments.
Howard, and thereafter Dr. Avner Falk.
Michael, thank you very much. My own practical-academic interest is the intra-Jewish community factors and relationships and decision-making. Right, so my question relates to that. It might also be noted that the irony is this week in New York is some of this same intra-Jewish turf battling is taking place over some of, at the claims conference over some of these same issues of distribution particularly. But the dilemmas that you present, that you call the gray areas, some of them philosophical, some of them practical, like Foxman's notion of do we diminish the memory of the victims versus payments to attorneys and distribution itself. To what extent, as you look at the picture, did leadership within the Jewish organizations conceptually attempt together, or at least even within any given organization, to deal with those issues in a thoughtful kind of way, a planful policy kind of way, versus to what extent did they just jump in and fight it out for the distribution, for instance, or allow the chips to fall where they may vis-a-vis who takes the cases and what they may charge?
Right. I don't think there was much planning. And I think it's also impossible to go ahead and do much planning when you do it through the mechanism of litigation. And all of these settlements came through the litigation mechanism. And so it really was, in a sense, organizations coming forth and taking some kind of a role in that. As an example, I mentioned the World Jewish Congress. We can mention specific individuals. Israel Singer, who's one of the major negotiators. As a result of this, is now the president of the claims conference. And the WJC and the various people that it has who kind of sit on different boards. I'm not part of the organized Jewish world, so I was kind of seeing this for the first time. And I surprised me how few individuals, wearing so many different hats. In this French bank settlement, it was the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who played a major role. And they were involved in negotiations. And in that settlement, they actually did something I thought was very worthwhile, is as part of the settlement money, they allocated a certain portion of a representative actually sitting in that commission, kind of being an ombudsman, an overseer, to see how the settlement money is being distributed. I think that was an important role to play, but even in the French bank settlement, there was a story a couple of weeks ago that's saying the average payout is $3,000, to the claimants. Why is it so little? So, the ombudsman played an important role. I'm not sure how much of a difference, is made. I don't think there's been really much talk or much organization. I also saw, again as an outsider, different Jewish groups kind of fighting with each other, or different Jewish groups kind of taking its little turf. I didn't see the WJC taking a strong stand in the French bank settlement, because that seems to be the Simon Wiesenthal Center's territory. And I didn't see the Simon Wiesenthal Center coming in and playing a large role in the Swiss bank settlement. Right? Again, I'm just an observer. I'm telling you what I see, from the heights of the ivory tower looking down.
Avner, and afterwards Shoshana Bari.
First of all, thank you for a very interesting and moving lecture too. I elicited a lot of responses in me, and I would like to make them as brief as I can. First of all, as a remark on the previous speaker, the word shilumim in Hebrew, which is what's used to designate the reparations from Germany, has an additional meaning to payment, and it is revenge, because there is an expression yom nakam v'shilem. So it's like a payback. It's like which is very interesting, because the Germans are using Wiedergutmachung, which is a positive word, and we're using shilumim, which has a tinge of revenge in it. So that's one observation. Another is, in the interest of full disclosure, as they say in America, that I'm also a child of survivors in the sense of flight survivors, like you are. My parents fled Germany and Poland in the 30s, but they came directly to Palestine. I don't know if that qualifies them as survivors as such. Again, as you say, it's a matter of definition and how you conceptualize it. I'll get to this point just in a minute. But I think Switzerland in this case has a very interesting role, because my mother's brothers were also involved in being expelled from Switzerland, for example. And Switzerland, as you say, used to be conceived of as a wonderful, quiet, peaceful place that helped the Jews, took them in and so on. And then it turned out, in a kind of reverse of idealization, it became a kind of denigration, kind of what we call splitting. In other words, either Switzerland is wonderful or it is terrible. In reality, it is neither, or it is both. And there are Jews who have spent the war in Switzerland as flight survivors and that were treated wonderfully and had wonderful memories. On the other hand, there were other Jews in Switzerland who were in work camps and almost concentration camps and had terrible memories. And I attended one meeting of Alumim, which is a group of those children who were hidden as children in Europe during the war. And I heard both sides of the story. So I think it's quite complex. Switzerland has a special country, which is not even a member of the European Union, a kind of isolated fortress and was neutral during the war and so on. And so we tend to sort of psychologically attribute all kinds of things to Switzerland. And now I want to get to the question of the trigger. Now, if I remember correctly, in terms of factual things, that it happened with the visit of Bronfman to Bern, and that he wasn't even offered a chair when he came to visit the Swiss representatives. And that elicited a furious response. I think he was not alone. I don't remember who was with him, whether it was Eisenstadt or someone else.
No, Singer was with him,
Singer.
and Elon Steinberg.
Right. So these people were not offered chairs to sit on,
Yeah.
which was a gesture of humiliation as they took it. And so that elicited a whole chain of events. And I wondered if you would comment on this. And then there's the question of the term of flight survivors. There are in Israel sometimes, as you say, Jew against Jew, there's jealousies and envy among certain Jews who say, we are not German Jews and therefore we are not getting reparations as the German Jews are getting because we're Polish or Czech or Russian or whatever. And then finally the question of claims, insurance claims, which is, as you say, Generali, Assicurazioni Generali being one of the major players there. This is an Italian company, and then the Swiss claims for being expelled from Switzerland, as one of my mother's brothers was, and another brother, I have to deal now with a claim against insurance, which is based in Holland, for some reason, the office, that's interesting also. The office for the Swiss expulsion claim is in New York, but the office for the Italian insurance claims is in Holland, Netherlands. So now we know that Swiss and Italian anti-Semitism has been around for a very long time, since the Middle Ages. We need only to think of the Jews that were burned in Switzerland alive, and the Simon of Trent and so on. I mean, everybody around this table knows these things. So I wonder again what the psychological significance, if any, of this may be. Thank you very much, and I apologize for having so many questions.
Okay, I'll try to reach most of them. I'll take the last one first. The Swiss government did do a study after the Swiss bank settlement, and anti-Semitism, according to this government study, actually rose. And this is actually, this is prior now to what is going on right now, with the Fada and the reaction to it, how the Europeans are doing. So we're talking at a whole different level. But at least during that time, they did see a negative, reaction to it. And in fact, Foxman, in his critique, used it as a basis. Says you don't want to increase anti-Semitism, and it's not worth it. You mentioned about the chair, the famous chair that he was not given. It makes a great story. I have it in my book too.
Is that true?
No, I mean, I wasn't there. He says, what happened? When I mentioned that story, I mentioned to someone who is Swiss, and he says, well, that's just, nobody else was given a chair, and that's just when you meet in Switzerland, you're not given a chair. It's just, it's like a cocktail party where everybody's standing. So, but, Bronfman says, and, I take him at his word, that he says that lack of a chair cost the Swiss $1.25 billion. What happened really there was that when he talked to the Swiss Banker Association, they offered him a certain amount of money, not to him personally, but they said, let's go ahead and settle these claims. We found 774 dormant accounts. Let's put a number out. And to his credit, Bronfman says, I'm not here looking for an amount. I'm looking here for information. And so what he forced the Swiss Banker Association is to create this commission of eminent persons, that's what they called it. Paul Volcker came on board as the head of that commission, and they did the most expensive audit, ever done, going through all the banks, the cantorial banks and the large banks, and in Zurich, trying to figure out, the dormant accounts. They discovered 4.1 million dormant accounts, in those banks related to the 33-45 period. Doesn't mean that all those were accounts of Holocaust, victims, but the numbers which they're finding, are astounding. I talk about in the book, and I talk the story about a woman living in the Czech Republic, the city of Brno, B-R-N-O. Her father was a patent lawyer, and she remembered that he had Swiss clients. So she made an application for this, for her father's money. Maybe he's got a bank account. Turned out that her aunt, who was a concert singer who fled Germany, had 5 accounts at an unidentified bank, equaling today to $3.8 million. Right? And there are stories like this. All of the nice thing, I think the very worthwhile thing about the Swiss settlement is that it's a very transparent settlement because it's done through the American court system. Every one of these awards is posted, and you can take a look at it. And I think to Bronfman's credit, he didn't go for the bait. He wanted to get the information. And I call the Swiss bank settlement the mother of all Holocaust restitution settlements. If the Swiss bank settlement did not occur, I don't think any of this would have happened. With regard to the Jew versus Jew, which I sort of throw out as quaintly to sort of summarize this whole problem, I'll tell you what bothers me. I don't get as much bothered reading the articles about it in the New York Jewish Week or the Los Angeles Jewish Journal. I do, get bothered when I see it as a page 1 story in the New York Times. Right? And you know the Yiddish phrase, how it goes with that. But it's part of the story. And it's.
What was that Yiddish phrase?
Well, you don't want to. How do you say it? You don't want to throw the dirty laundry in front of the goyim. Okay. Right. My Yiddish fails me at this moment.
Thank you.
Shoshana, and afterwards Dr. Shaul Baumer.
I would like to ask you about another gray area, which is the money that was deposited in American banks that was confiscated by the American government. I know there was a presidential committee at the end of the century to deal with this. What do you think about the American, the way the Americans took care of their dormant bank account?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Let me make it into a broader statement and also correct a misconception. And it's a misconception that Eisenstadt, when he speaks, he puts that out and he's wrong. I double-checked this. The dormant accounts of any significance in American banks have not been found. Holocaust survivors have not come forward, right, and have said, we had money in an American bank account. The Presidential Commission for Holocaust, Presidential Advisory Commission for Holocaust Assets, otherwise known as the Bronfman Commission, because Bronfman was heading it, looked into that issue. And they went through the New York State Banking Department, and I spoke specifically to the individual who was like the expert on this, and he had no reason for hiding this and going through the information. They didn't find this information, all right? And so it just doesn't exist. I have to tell you in response to this, and this is something that I've been doing, a month of research here, there are claims against Israeli banks. And I have to tell you that at least what I'm seeing is the Israeli banks are not acting very differently from the Swiss banks. And it makes me feel very, very sad that that is happening. And that is a problem. And Holocaust survivors are coming for that. At the same time, pardon me?
And that's going to be page 1 New York Times.
Yeah, at some point. At the same time, I have to tell you that this presidential commission didn't do a very good job. They spent a lot of money. What they didn't look at, and I think they should have looked at, is the role of American companies, okay, during World War II. So the very first lawsuit, for instance, that was filed for slave labor was against Ford Motor Company. Because when the U.S. Army went ahead and went into the German city of Cologne and they liberated the plant, the Ford plant in Cologne, they found slaves working at the Ford plant. One of them was this woman, Elsa Ivanova, who came originally from Russia and who now lives in Belgium. And the very first lawsuit filed for slave labor compensation was by this woman. And so Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Kodak, a number of the banks, profited in dealing with Nazi Germany. The most known about this, because the book came out of this, is Edwin Black's book on IBM, and their involvement with it. And that's something that the Presidential Commission did not want to touch. And I think there was a double standard at play. That the kind of scrutiny that private European companies were put under, American companies avoided that kind of scrutiny. And the Bush administration has no interest in resurrecting this commission and looking at that. It's sad.
Shaul, and afterwards Dr. Ephraim Zurov.
Yeah, as I am a member on the board of Austrian Jews here in Israel, I can appreciate as double as much your words on the restitution of Jewish people. And being Austrian born, I would like to ask if you can enlarge a bit on that question, because there is a lot of money now stuck in Austria, because the Austrians, they desire that we should be sure that we, the Austrians, should be sure that never will be again against them something to demand. And we have here in Israel about 4,000, I am not sure about the number because this number is diminishing every day. Survivors, some of them in very bad case, and we can't help them because this money is stuck and we can't get reach of that money. So I would like to ask you, please, if you can enlarge a bit.
Let me elaborate on this. The settlement with Austria came on the eve, the last 3 days of the Clinton administration. The clock was running. And Eisenstadt was working very hard in order to get that settlement because they realized that this was their last chance to do so. When you hurry on something, you forget not just small details but large details. So they ended up getting the settlement, and then later on many problems arose as a result of that. How do you deal with the problems in the United States? The way that it's common. You go to court. So survivors went to court and filed a lawsuit, to overturn the Austrian settlement. And the Austrians said something that I understand is reasonable. I don't agree with it, but it's reasonable, that we want the same thing that the Germans want. We want legal peace. And until all these lawsuits are